The Orphan Ward in 1889 New York was a place that never slept. It existed as a grim reminder of the darkest corners of humanity, where children, abandoned and forgotten, lived in a never-ending nightmare. The moment you set foot in the ward, you could almost hear the faint echoes of cries, faint, almost like whispers, lingering in the walls. It wasn't just the hunger or the illness that kept them awake, but something more, something that permeated the very air they breathed. It was as if the building itself had been cursed by the collective pain of its young inhabitants, the souls of children who had no choice but to endure. The ward that never slept wasn't just a place where children were left to suffer. It was a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. This institution, at its core, was a reflection of society's neglect for its most vulnerable. In a city teeming with wealth and rapid industrialization, orphan children were discarded as little more than burdens, to be housed and fed with little regard for their well-being. But the New York Orphan Ward in question wasn't like any other. It became infamous not just for its neglect, but for the stories that circulated about it. Stories of children crying out in the middle of the night, sounds that could not be explained, shadows that seemed to move on their own. Some believed that the spirits of those who had died under the ward's roof never left. Others spoke of strange happenings that defied logic. And yet, for the longest time, these stories were written off as nothing more than rumors. That is, until the evidence started to surface. In the late 1800s, when this ward was established, New York was a city at the height of its transformation. The Industrial Revolution had swept through the city like wildfire, bringing with it an influx of immigrants, a booming economy, and a new wave of social unrest. Poverty was rampant, and child labor was a grim reality for many families struggling to survive. For orphan children, however, the world was even bleaker. They were cast aside, placed into institutions that promised safety but often delivered little more than neglect and abuse. It wasn't uncommon for children to disappear from the records, or to die from diseases that could have been prevented with proper care. The orphan wards, which were supposed to provide a refuge, became factories of misery, places where children were often treated less like humans and more like statistics. But this particular ward stood out for reasons far darker than the others. By the time it reached its peak in 1889, whispers of strange occurrences were beginning to circulate. Nurses and staff reported hearing unexplained noises in the dead of night, footsteps where there should have been none, the faint sound of children crying in rooms long abandoned. It was as if the entire building was alive, haunted by the souls of those who had passed through its doors, many of whom had died young, without ever knowing love or safety. Some even claimed to have seen figures moving in the shadows, though when they went to investigate, no one was there. The ward itself, located in a quiet part of the city, appeared at first glance to be just another institutional building. It was tall and imposing, its cold stone walls built to withstand the years, its windows dark and forbidding. But for those who spent any amount of time inside, the building was more than just an old structure, it was a prison. For the children confined there, it was a world of constant noise, a world where sleep seemed impossible. The constant crying, the harsh commands of the staff, and the ever-present fear of disease or punishment meant that rest was a luxury they could never afford. The ward was supposed to offer them respite, but it only gave them the worst of both worlds, never-ending exhaustion and endless pain. As the ward's reputation grew, so did the rumors. They spoke of strange figures who came in the night, figures who had no business being there. Were these just the imaginings of traumatized children, or was there something more? Some of the children, many of whom were too young to understand the full scope of what was happening around them, began to report things that made even the adults uneasy. They spoke of shadow people who moved silently through the halls. Others claimed they saw faces pressed against the windows, faces that would vanish when they were looked at directly. Was this the trauma of a broken system manifesting itself in the minds of children, or was there truly something darker at play in the ward? As unsettling as these tales were, they weren't just confined to the children. The staff, who were meant to be the caregivers, were also deeply affected by the strange happenings within the ward. They, too, reported hearing noises at night, scratching at the walls, whispers of voices that seemed to echo from the very stones of the building itself. At first, these were dismissed as the result of exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But as the reports continued, it became clear that something was not right. It was as though the building had become alive with the sorrow of its inhabitants, their suffering lingering in every corner. In addition to the eerie atmosphere, the conditions inside the ward were nothing short of appalling. Overcrowding was rampant. The rooms, designed to house a few dozen children, were packed with hundreds, forcing them to sleep on hard, cold floors with little more than thin blankets to keep them warm. The sanitation was poor, and the staff, overwhelmed and underpaid, could do little to alleviate the suffering. Disease was common. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and diphtheria were rampant in these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Death was a frequent visitor, and the bodies of children who succumbed to illness were often removed without ceremony, buried in unmarked graves. Many of these children never received proper medical attention. Instead, they were left to suffer in silence, their cries ignored by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The ward was supposed to be a place of safety, a place where these orphan children could rest, recover, and perhaps even have a chance at a better life. But for many of them, the ward became a tomb, a place where their suffering was not only ignored but, in many cases, exacerbated by the institution's failure to provide the care they desperately needed. And yet, for all the darkness, there was something unsettling about the way the ward seemed to refuse to rest. It was as if the souls of those children, trapped in the prison of their young bodies, refused to be forgotten. Their pain, their agony, their voices, they never truly left. The stories from the ward were not just whispers anymore. They had become a legend, one that haunted the minds of those who had heard them. People who had visited the ward, or who had worked there, often spoke in hushed tones about the nocturnal disturbances, about the overwhelming feeling of being watched, about the children whose cries seemed to echo in their minds long after they had left. And as the years passed, the ward became a symbol of the city's failure to care for its most vulnerable. It was a tragic reminder of the human cost of indifference and neglect. The orphan ward of 1889 New York was a place that never slept, and for good reason. It was haunted not just by the memory of those who had died within its walls, but by the ghosts of those who had lived, trapped in a nightmare of neglect, sickness, and despair. The shadows that moved through the ward at night were not just figments of imagination. They were the manifestations of the suffering that had taken place there. And though the ward may have eventually closed its doors, the stories of what happened there still echo in the dark corners of history, waiting to be heard. In 1889, New York City was a place of paradox. On one hand, it was the epicenter of America's rapid industrialization, a bustling metropolis teeming with ambition and progress. The skyline was rapidly changing with towering steel structures that seemed to reach for the heavens. Streets that had once been narrow and cobblestone were now crowded with horse-drawn carriages, the new electric streetcars, and an ever-growing population that included millions of immigrants seeking refuge from poverty and unrest in Europe. It was a city on the brink of modernity, yet beneath the glimmering surface, it was plagued by deep social issues that could not be easily ignored. In the shadows of this growing empire, the most vulnerable members of society, the orphaned, the abandoned, the poor, suffered in silence. At the time, New York had no shortage of institutions claiming to care for its orphan children. But these institutions were not designed to nurture. They were created out of necessity, out of a desperate need to house and control the growing number of abandoned children. The orphanages were supposed to be places of refuge, yet they were often overcrowded, underfunded, and severely understaffed. The societal perception of orphan children, too, was a stark reflection of the era's indifference. Orphans were seen not as victims of circumstance but as burdens, as statistics. They were the forgotten children of the city, those whose parents were either deceased, incarcerated, or simply too poor to care for them. And in a city that was obsessed with progress, these children were often regarded as little more than invisible. The attitudes towards orphans in the late 19th century were informed by the prevailing social mindset of the time. The prevailing belief was that these children were in need of discipline, structure, and, above all, hard work. In the growing industrial age, there was a pervasive belief in the moral value of labor, and orphanages were seen as places where children could be taught the importance of order, obedience, and productivity. The city, in its relentless drive for progress, viewed these children not as individuals but as potential workers who could contribute to the growing economic machine. Institutions were set up not to provide comfort or safety, but to mold these children into useful members of society. The care they received was secondary to their ability to be shaped and processed. Orphanages were often viewed as large, impersonal institutions designed to handle large numbers of children. These facilities were essentially factories for human lives, meant to churn out obedient, industrious adults. In the eyes of the city's elite and the public at large, they were necessary but unremarkable. The most important thing was that they kept these children out of sight, away from the city's more affluent neighborhoods. As a result, the conditions within many orphanages were abysmal. Poor sanitation, malnutrition, and a lack of proper medical care were common, and yet the public at large remained unaware of the depths of the neglect. These children were treated as numbers, shuffled in and out of the institutions with little thought given to their emotional or psychological needs. The ward we are focusing on in 1889 was no exception to this harsh reality. It was a place that housed hundreds of children, many of whom had no known relatives and no place to go. The ward was located in a part of the city that was far removed from the bustling heart of New York, a place that seemed to exist in its own isolated world. The building itself was a cold, imposing structure. Its stone walls were grim, and its windows were narrow, casting only fleeting glimpses of light into the rooms within. From the outside, it looked like any other institution of the time, but inside, it was a different story altogether. Within these walls, the children were subjected to a grueling routine. They were forced awake at dawn, their bodies sore from sleeping on hard wooden floors. The rooms were cramped, often filled with far more children than they were meant to hold. The air was thick with the smell of illness, damp, musty, and tainted with the odor of unwashed bodies. Food was scarce, and when it was served, it was bland and lacking in nutritional value. The children were often sick, suffering from diseases that spread like wildfire in the overcrowded conditions. There was no respite from the physical discomforts, no relief from the constant tension in the air. The constant noise, the shuffling of feet, the cries of children, the harsh voices of the caregivers, never stopped. It was a place that never rested, where sleep was elusive and dreams, if they came at all, were filled with shadows. The ward was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where children could find some semblance of stability in a world that had abandoned them. But for many of the children who found themselves trapped within its walls, it was a prison. The staff were overworked and undertrained, and they viewed their charges not as children but as a burden, one that was difficult to bear. The caregivers had little time for empathy. They were tasked with the difficult job of managing a facility that was bursting at the seams, and they did so with a sense of detachment that bordered on indifference. It wasn't that the staff were necessarily cruel, but they were overwhelmed. They were simply trying to keep the institution running, to maintain some semblance of order in a place that had none. Medical care, such as it was a luxury. Many children who became ill in the ward were left to suffer, often untreated, and those who died were quickly removed from the ward and buried in unmarked graves. There was no grieving, no recognition of their lives, only the cold efficiency of moving them out of the way. Death was an ever-present visitor in the ward, and the children learned early on that their lives held little value. If they were lucky enough to survive, they might be placed in a new home or sent off to work in factories as soon as they were deemed old enough. But most didn't make it that far. Disease, starvation, and neglect took a heavy toll on the children, and many were lost to history, their names never recorded, their lives forgotten. The orphan ward in 1889 New York was part of a much larger systemic failure. It wasn't just one institution that failed the children, it was the entire system of care for orphaned and abandoned children. The society that built these institutions, that used them as tools of control, had created an environment where the welfare of these children was an afterthought. They were not seen as individuals but as expendable commodities, easily forgotten once they had served their purpose. The orphanages, in their cold, institutionalized design, mirrored the city's treatment of the poor and the disenfranchised. They were designed to house, control, and ultimately erase the problem of poverty and abandonment, but they never sought to alleviate the suffering of those who passed through their doors. This was the world that the children in the orphan ward of 1889 New York inhabited, a world where their very existence was a silent tragedy. They were children with no family, no protection, and no hope. The institution, which was supposed to be a place of refuge, became a place of torment. In the streets of New York, the city's progress was hailed as a triumph, but within the walls of the orphan wards, it was a tragedy unfolding in real time. The cries of the children echoed through the halls, unheard and ignored by the city that moved on without them, leaving them to suffer in the shadows. In the late 19th century, the establishment of orphan wards across New York City was intended to serve as a necessary response to the overwhelming number of abandoned children. The city was growing at an unprecedented rate, drawing in waves of immigrants and rural families seeking work in the factories and warehouses that dotted the industrial landscape. As the city expanded, so did its problems: poverty, disease, and child abandonment. By 1889, New York's orphanages had become a central fixture in the city's response to the rising number of orphan children. Yet, within this vast network of institutions, one particular ward was destined to become infamous for reasons far darker than the city's other orphanages. This orphan ward, located in a quieter part of the city, was founded with an intent that seemed noble on the surface, to care for orphan children and provide them with a safe place to grow. However, as with so many other institutions of the time, the reality was far removed from the ideals that inspired its creation. The ward's mission, at least according to its founders, was to serve as a sanctuary, a haven where the most vulnerable children could find refuge from the harshness of the outside world. But what began as a well-meaning institution quickly devolved into something far more sinister. The ward, instead of offering peace and safety, became a place where children were subjected to neglect, cruelty, and, in some cases, even death. When the ward was first established, it was under the leadership of a group of philanthropists and social reformers who believed they were doing something good for the children of New York. The city's orphan problem had reached a boiling point, and many of these reformers felt that they had a moral duty to provide shelter for the most vulnerable members of society. At the time, it was not uncommon for philanthropists to open institutions with the best of intentions, but to be woefully ignorant of the challenges they would face in managing them. The ward, like many others, was overcrowded from the start. Even though its original designers had the intention of offering comfort and security, the reality was far more bleak. As the number of children needing care continued to rise, the ward's capacity to house them increased, and its ability to offer meaningful care and supervision sharply diminished. The children who found their way to this ward often had little more than the clothes on their backs. Most of them had been abandoned by their parents, many of whom had died, been imprisoned, or simply could not afford to care for them. These children, often ranging from infants to teenagers, were gathered together in the ward's large rooms, crammed together in unsanitary conditions with little to no personal space. The rooms were often filled with the sick, the hungry, and the frightened, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and anxiety. This environment, coupled with the absence of true emotional support or proper medical care, left the children vulnerable to all manner of physical and psychological trauma. They were, in essence, warehoused in a place that was meant to care for them but instead added to their suffering. The staff who managed the ward, many of whom were not properly trained or equipped to care for such a large and vulnerable population, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of children under their care. Nurses, administrators, and attendants were often poorly compensated for their work, and many were far more concerned with the efficiency of the institution than with the individual well-being of the children. The ward, under such stress, began to take on the characteristics of an assembly line, where children were processed in and out, shuffled from room to room with little thought given to their long-term emotional needs or psychological health. The sheer volume of children meant that personal care was limited, and any form of individualized attention was scarce. The children, in effect, became faceless numbers, each one indistinguishable from the next. Some of the children were lucky enough to receive enough care to survive the harsh conditions of the ward. But for most, life was a daily struggle. The food was insufficient and of poor quality, leaving many of the children malnourished and weak. Disease spread quickly in the overcrowded rooms, and medical care was limited, often only provided after a child had already become seriously ill. Illnesses like smallpox, tuberculosis, and scarlet fever ran rampant, and many children who were already weak from malnutrition and neglect succumbed to these diseases. For those who didn't die, the lingering effects of their time in the ward would remain with them for the rest of their lives. In addition to the physical suffering, there was a deeper, more insidious trauma that the children endured. The emotional neglect was perhaps even more damaging than the lack of food or proper medical care. Many of the children in the ward had been separated from their families, and without the comforting presence of a parent or caregiver, they were left to navigate a world that was indifferent to their suffering. In an institution where the focus was on efficiency and control, there was little room for compassion or understanding. Children were expected to comply with the strict rules of the ward without question, to remain silent, and to accept their lot in life without protest. The psychological damage caused by this environment was profound. Many of the children became withdrawn, fearful, and traumatized, unable to form healthy attachments to others. The sense of abandonment that these children felt was not just physical but emotional. They were truly alone in the world, surrounded by hundreds of other children who, too, were lost and neglected. And yet, amidst all the hardship, there was a constant flow of children entering and leaving the ward. While some stayed only for a short time before being adopted or placed in foster homes, others were left to languish in the institution for years. For many of the children who had no families or relatives to take them in, the ward became their permanent home. These children often grew up within the institution's walls, moving from one stage of childhood into adolescence, their lives shaped by the institution that had been their only constant. As they aged, many were sent out into the workforce, placed in factories or homes to serve as labourists. The ward's administrators saw these children as potential workers to contribute to the city's growing industrial economy, but they rarely considered the lasting emotional scars that this life of neglect and exploitation would leave on them. One of the most tragic aspects of the ward's existence was its ability to perpetuate a cycle of abandonment. The children who were raised in the ward, without the emotional support or guidance of a family, were more likely to grow up to become parents who would be unable to care for their own children. The systemic nature of this neglect created a vicious cycle that was difficult to break. Children who had suffered abuse and neglect were then left to raise their own children in environments where they lacked the resources or the skills to provide the care they needed. This continued cycle of poverty and neglect compounded the ward's tragic legacy, ensuring that its influence extended far beyond the walls of the institution itself. For all its flaws, the ward was a reflection of a greater societal failure, a failure to recognize the humanity of the children it housed. The city's elite, who often turned a blind eye to the suffering of the poor and the abandoned, allowed these institutions to operate with little oversight. The orphan children were forgotten, their cries unheard, their pain invisible. The ward's true tragedy was that it was not just a building, it was a symptom of a larger societal indifference to the most vulnerable members of society. In a city of towering skyscrapers and relentless progress, these children were left to fend for themselves, their lives relegated to the margins of history. And the legacy of that neglect would linger long after the ward's doors were closed, echoing in the hearts of those who survived, and in the hearts of those who would never be given the chance to survive at all. Inside the orphan ward, the daily life of its inhabitants was a relentless cycle of hardship, discomfort, and fear. What should have been a place of refuge became a site of constant survival. For the children who found themselves trapped within its cold walls, life was a cruel imitation of safety, where their existence was dictated not by warmth, care, or empathy, but by rules that prioritized order and efficiency above all else. The institutional structure of the ward, designed with military precision, left little room for humanity. The corridors echoed with the cries of children too young to understand why they had been abandoned, and the walls seemed to absorb the sound, trapping the despair within. From the moment they woke, the children were swept into a regimented routine that barely allowed for rest, let alone moments of joy. The days began at the crack of dawn, often before the first light of morning touched the sky. The ward's inhabitants, young and old, were forced out of their shared sleeping spaces, which consisted of rows of iron cots pushed together with little regard for comfort or privacy. The cold metal of the bed frames seemed to leach the warmth from their bodies, and the thin, threadbare blankets offered no protection from a chill. Those who had been fortunate enough to fall asleep the previous night were roused early, their slumber interrupted by the harsh sounds of bells or the stern voice of a caretaker barking commands. Sleep, a vital refuge from the misery of the waking world, was constantly out of reach. Children lay awake for hours, trapped in a cycle of anxiety and discomfort. Meals were scarce and of poor quality. The children were served bland porridge, stale bread, and a thin broth that offered little nourishment. The food was barely enough to sustain them, and malnutrition became a constant threat. The portions were small, and often, there was not enough to go around. Those who were weakest, those who were ill or frail, were left to fight over what little food was available, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. The food itself was often old and tasteless, barely edible, and served in large, metal trays that seemed as unappetizing as the meals they held. The children were never given enough to fill their stomachs, and their bodies, underfed and overworked, began to show the signs of deprivation. But it wasn't just the physical deprivation that made life in the ward unbearable. The emotional strain was perhaps even more damaging. These children, many of whom had already experienced the trauma of being abandoned or orphaned, were now subjected to a world of harsh discipline and indifference. The caretakers, overwhelmed by the sheer number of children in their charge, had little time for compassion or nurturing. The children were expected to follow orders without question, to sit quietly, and to keep to themselves. Any deviation from the routine, any sign of disobedience or even simple curiosity, was met with harsh reprimands, sometimes accompanied by physical punishment. The children were made to understand, very quickly, that their emotions and needs were irrelevant. The ward was not a place for kindness or comfort. It was a place for conformity. The daily schedule was grueling and unforgiving. After the morning bell signaled the start of the day, the children were made to attend to their chores, which often consisted of menial tasks like cleaning the hallways, scrubbing floors, and tending to the few small gardens that the institution maintained. The work was exhausting, leaving little time for rest or leisure. The tasks were monotonous and repetitive, and the children, who were still in the formative years of their lives, were treated more like small adults than like the vulnerable young ones they truly were. There was little time for play or for personal development. In fact, there was little time for anything that could be considered normal childhood activity. Once their chores were completed, the children were lined up for a brief and unsatisfying meal, after which they were expected to return to their rooms or common areas for more structured activities. These activities were often focused on learning obedience rather than fostering creativity or intellectual growth. Some of the older children were taught rudimentary skills such as reading and writing, but the instruction was basic and devoid of any true educational value. The primary goal of the institution seemed to be to make these children fit into a system, one that valued order and obedience over curiosity and critical thinking. The ward became a place where individuality was stifled, and the children learned early on that their thoughts and desires were of no importance. For the younger children, the days were even more oppressive. They were left in rooms with few toys or books, and what little play they did engage in was often stifled by the stern presence of caretakers who saw such activities as distractions from the tasks at hand. These children spent their days in silence, isolated from one another, as they were taught that to be seen or heard was to be a burden. Even simple childhood games were forbidden, leaving the children to suffer in a world of loneliness and confinement. The lack of interaction among the children only deepened their sense of isolation. Even in a space filled with other children, the ward's inhabitants often felt as though they were the only ones alive in a world of darkness. Sickness and disease ran rampant through the institution, a byproduct of the overcrowding and unsanitary conditions. The ward, which was ill-equipped to handle even the basic health needs of its residents, became a breeding ground for infections and illnesses. When one child became ill, the rest were often quickly exposed to the same sickness. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and scarlet fever were common, and the ward's sparse medical supplies were no match for the scale of the health crisis. The children, already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion, were particularly vulnerable to disease. There was no system in place to provide adequate care, and when children fell ill, they were often left to fend for themselves. The staff, overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick children, could do little more than offer basic treatments, when they were offered at all. For many of the children, illness meant a slow, painful death. The sick were often segregated from the healthy, placed in separate rooms or sections of the ward where their suffering was hidden from view. There, in isolation, the children lingered in pain, without the comfort of loved ones or even the most basic of comforts. Some died quietly, their names never recorded, their deaths never acknowledged. Others fought for their lives, but in a place like the ward, where survival was a daily struggle, few made it out alive. The constant threat of illness hung over every child, leaving them in a state of perpetual fear. It wasn't just the fear of being sick, it was the fear of being forgotten, of being left to die in a cold, dark room with no one to mourn them. But even amidst the suffering, there were fleeting moments of hope, brief, almost imperceptible moments where the children, despite the oppression of their daily lives, managed to find small pockets of resistance. For some, it came in the form of quiet conversations with others, whispers of shared stories or dreams of a better life. For others, it came through small acts of defiance, a child daring to smile, or even a brief moment of laughter that could not be completely stifled. These moments were fleeting, but they were vital. They were the remnants of a childhood that refused to be entirely crushed beneath the weight of the ward's cruelty. Though the ward's inhabitants were forced to live a life of forced labor, isolation, and fear, they were not completely stripped of their humanity. Even in the face of overwhelming neglect, the children retained a spark of resilience. It was this spark, though battered and hidden beneath layers of trauma, that allowed them to survive in the face of almost unimaginable hardship. They lived in a place that never allowed them to rest, yet within the deepest corners of their hearts, they held onto a fragment of hope, hope that perhaps, one day, they would be free. As the days bled into one another within the orphan ward, a sense of quiet despair became ingrained in the fabric of its walls. The children, each with their own tragic story of abandonment and loss, began to exist in a liminal space, somewhere between life and death, between the tangible world they knew and the one they longed for. In the ward, they were not truly alive, but neither were they dead. The very institution that was meant to offer them safety, shelter, and care instead became a place of relentless suffering and neglect. Their days were filled with an endless series of monotonous routines, devoid of joy, warmth, or love. And yet, as bleak as it seemed, the ward also served as a paradoxical testament to human endurance and survival, proof that even in the most dehumanizing of circumstances, The human spirit is capable of holding on to a spark of resilience, no matter how faint. The ward's administrators, too, seemed to exist within a parallel reality. Their primary concern, as with many institutions of the time, was maintaining order and discipline. The children's welfare was of secondary importance, and any attempt to prioritize their emotional or psychological well-being was quickly quashed by the need for efficiency and control. The staff, many of whom were underpaid, overworked, and ill-equipped to handle the emotional and physical demands of caring for so many children, had become indifferent to the suffering they were witnessing daily. The cold, institutional atmosphere that pervaded the ward was a reflection of the broader societal apathy toward its most vulnerable citizens. These children were seen not as individuals, but as problems to be managed, their needs reduced to mere statistics in a system that placed little value on their lives. And yet, despite the systematic cruelty that defined life in the orphanage, the children who lived there formed fragile, tentative bonds with one another. These fleeting connections were the only form of comfort and companionship available to them in a world that had stripped them of their families, their identities, and their hopes. The children, isolated from the outside world and from any form of adult affection, learned to cling to each other for survival. Friendships, although rare, formed in the quiet corners of the ward, where whispered conversations and shared memories became the only reprieve from the harshness of their existence. These brief moments of companionship, though impermanent, were a lifeline. They gave the children something to hold on to, a glimmer of what could have been, a taste of what it might have been like to grow up in a world that wasn't filled with fear and suffering. But such moments were always fleeting. The ward's administrators, intent on maintaining strict order, kept a tight grip on every aspect of the children's lives. Any signs of emotional attachment were viewed as a potential threat to the ward's rigid structure. The staff, accustomed to enforcing discipline through punishment, knew that any act of rebellion, any sign of affection between children, could disrupt the delicate balance of control they had worked so hard to maintain. The children were encouraged to distrust one another, to view each other as rivals for the limited resources available. The ward, in many ways, became a microcosm of a larger, indifferent world, one in which survival often meant sacrificing the very things that made life worth living. For the children who had lived in the ward for extended periods, life became an endless struggle to maintain some sense of identity and self-worth in a place that refused to acknowledge their individuality. The constant dehumanization they experienced was further compounded by the fact that they were never given a chance to truly be children. They were denied the luxury of dreams, of ambition, of simple pleasures. Instead, their lives were consumed by the harsh realities of survival. For those who were lucky enough to survive the early years of the ward, the future was a grim prospect. Most were quickly ushered into the workforce, placed in factories or sent to work for other institutions that perpetuated the cycle of poverty and neglect. These children were not given a chance to grow up in a world that offered opportunity or possibility. They were instead groomed for a life of servitude, their education limited to the practical skills necessary to make them useful to the factory system. Many children, particularly those who had grown too old for the orphanage, were quickly pushed out into the streets once they reached their teenage years. For these children, the ward had not been a sanctuary, but a prison, a place where they were warehoused and left to grow up without any hope for a better future. Once they were too old to remain in the ward, they were often sent to work in the factories that dotted New York's industrial landscape. These factories, which were notorious for their exploitation of child labor, became the next phase of the children's lives. They worked long hours in dangerous, unsanitary conditions, their bodies and minds further battered by the relentless demands of factory life. For those children who had been at the ward the longest, the transition from orphan to worker was seamless. There was no real break from the institutionalized life they had come to know. They were simply moved from one form of exploitation to another. But the ward's impact was not limited to the children who passed through its doors. The institution became a symbol of the larger societal indifference toward the plight of the poor and the orphaned. It was a reflection of the broader system of institutionalized neglect that pervaded society at the time. The orphanage was not just a single, isolated example of abuse. It was part of a larger trend, one in which the most vulnerable members of society were abandoned to institutions that were more concerned with their ability to produce than with their ability to thrive. It was a reflection of a world that had failed to recognize the inherent humanity of its children, a world that treated its younger citizens as little more than commodities to be used and discarded. The ward's legacy was, in many ways, a direct result of the societal attitudes that prevailed at the time. The orphan children who lived there were seen as disposable, their lives considered expendable. They were not given the tools to succeed, to grow, or to contribute meaningfully to society. Instead, they were shaped by the system into workers who would toil away in factories, their hopes and dreams crushed under the weight of an indifferent system. For those children who did manage to survive the ward, their chances of breaking free from this cycle were slim. The ward had succeeded in doing what it was designed to do. It had transformed the children into cogs in a much larger, dehumanizing machine. The physical and emotional scars left by the ward were not easily erased. Many of the children who had survived its grasp grew up to live lives filled with the same sense of abandonment and despair that had defined their childhood. They struggled to form meaningful relationships, haunted by the trauma of their early years. The emotional neglect they had experienced in the ward had lasting effects, shaping their interactions with others and often leaving them feeling disconnected from the world around them. They had learned, at a young age, that they were not worthy of love, of care, or of affection. These lessons were difficult to unlearn, and for many, the consequences of this early emotional abuse echoed throughout their lives. As time went on, the stories of the children who had passed through the ward became a part of the larger narrative of New York's industrial growth. The ward, like many other orphanages of the time, became a symbol of the darker side of progress, of a city that had built its wealth on the backs of the most vulnerable. The children who had survived the ward, and the memories of those who had not, were relegated to the shadows of history. Their lives, their suffering, and their resilience went largely unacknowledged, as the city moved forward, focused on the promise of wealth and modernity. The orphan ward, and the lives it affected, became little more than a forgotten chapter in the city's grand story of progress. But for those who had lived through it, the trauma endured long after the ward's doors were closed for good. The children, once abandoned and ignored, were left to carry the weight of their memories, their voices silenced by a system that had failed them at every turn. As the years passed and the stories of the orphan ward began to fade into the annals of history, a lingering sense of injustice hung in the air, like the ghost of an era that had long since passed but refused to be forgotten. The ward, in its final years, had become a symbol of institutionalized neglect, a glaring reminder of a society that had been all too willing to turn a blind eye to the suffering of its most vulnerable citizens. But even after the ward closed its doors, the echoes of the children who had lived and died there reverberated through the corridors of history, their stories lost in the shuffle of time, forgotten by the very city that had allowed them to suffer. The closure of the orphan ward was not a moment of triumph or redemption. Rather, it was a reflection of the changing attitudes toward the care of children in New York City. By the turn of the 20th century, child welfare reform movements were beginning to take root across the nation, and the public's awareness of the plight of orphan children was slowly increasing. New laws were being passed, new institutions were being founded, and new systems of care were being implemented. However, the old orphanages, like the ward, were deeply entrenched in the system and did not change overnight. The children who had been housed there had already been subjected to years of trauma, neglect, and abuse, and their suffering was not easily erased by new policies or reforms. For many of them, the scars they carried would last a lifetime. The orphan ward's legacy, therefore, was one of silence. It was a silent tragedy, marked by the absence of compassion and the deafening roar of institutional apathy. The children who had been housed there were often lost to history, their names forgotten, their deaths unacknowledged. The ward had failed to record the names of the children who had passed through its doors, and those who had perished within its walls were buried without ceremony or recognition. They were treated as nothing more than disposable commodities, cast aside when they were no longer of use. The stories of their suffering, their pain, and their eventual deaths were left to fade into oblivion, hidden behind the cold, unfeeling walls of the institution. But the stories of these children did not disappear completely. As the years went by, survivors, those few who managed to escape the ward's grasp, began to speak out. They told of the horrors they had endured, the pain they had suffered, and the trauma that had marked them for life. These survivors, many of whom had been children when they entered the ward, became the voices that were finally heard. They began to piece together the fragmented stories of their time in the institution, sharing what they could remember of their lives there. Their accounts were fragmented, often incomplete, but they provided a glimpse into the dark, oppressive world of the orphan ward. The survivors' stories were heartbreaking, filled with tales of abandonment, neglect, and death. They spoke of children who had never known the warmth of a parent's embrace, of children who had been forced to grow up too quickly, without the protection and comfort that every child deserves. They told of overcrowded rooms where the smell of illness and decay was ever present, of the constant noise and clamor of children fighting for attention and survival. They described the strict and unyielding discipline that governed every aspect of their lives, the lack of love or compassion, and the way they were treated as little more than machines, expected to work, obey, and survive without question. For many of the survivors, the trauma they had endured at the orphan ward shaped the rest of their lives in profound and lasting ways. They struggled with feelings of abandonment, with a deep-seated sense of unworthiness, and with the emotional scars left by years of neglect. Many of them never fully recovered from their experiences in the ward. They struggled with relationships, with trust, and with the ability to feel safe in the world around them. The psychological toll of their time in the institution was far-reaching, and for some, it was impossible to overcome. The stories of the survivors were not just personal accounts of hardship. They were also a collective cry for justice, a demand for recognition of the wrongs that had been done. The orphan ward, and others like it, had existed as a system of institutionalized cruelty, a system that prioritized efficiency and control over the well-being of the children it was supposed to protect. The survivors, in their own ways, were demanding that their suffering not be forgotten, that the world acknowledge the deep and lasting impact of these institutions on their lives. Yet even as the survivors spoke out, the city of New York, indeed, society as a whole, remained largely indifferent to their cries. The orphan ward's legacy was one of silence, not just for the children who had suffered there, but for the generations of survivors who carried the burden of that suffering. The city, focused on its rapid expansion and its growing role as an industrial powerhouse, had no time for the forgotten children of its past. The wards had been closed, but the pain endured, the memories of the children who had lived there remaining trapped in the shadows of the city's history. It wasn't until much later, in the years following the closure of the ward and the subsequent reforms to child welfare systems, that the true scale of the suffering in these institutions began to be fully recognized. The stories of the survivors were slowly pieced together by historians, social workers, and activists who sought to shed light on the systemic abuse that had taken place within the walls of the orphanages. As the records of the ward were uncovered, a clearer picture emerged, one of a system that had failed its children at every level, from the lack of basic care and supervision to the unrelenting physical and emotional neglect that had defined the lives of those who had been forced to live there. In some ways, the orphan ward's legacy was a catalyst for change. The suffering of its children, though largely ignored during their lifetimes, became the foundation for a movement toward child welfare reform. The stories of abuse and neglect began to shape public opinion, and slowly, the system began to shift. New policies were enacted to better protect children, to offer them the care and support they needed, and to ensure that no child would ever again be subjected to the horrors that had unfolded in the orphanages of the late 19th century. However, for those who had lived through it, these reforms came too late. The scars of their childhoods were permanent, and the memories of the orphan ward would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The children of the orphan ward, those who survived, and those who perished, became part of a larger narrative, a tragic, almost forgotten chapter of New York's history. Their names, though many were lost to time, symbolized the suffering of countless other children who had been abandoned by society. The legacy of the ward, and of similar institutions, was one of pain, loss, and missed opportunities. It was a reminder that the most vulnerable members of society, the children, had been neglected, not just by the system, but by the society that allowed such neglect to persist. Today, the stories of those who lived and died in the orphan ward are often relegated to the margins of history. The ward itself has long since faded into obscurity, its building likely replaced with new structures that have little to no memory of the past. But the children who once filled its halls, whose lives were shaped by suffering, whose voices went unheard, remain an enduring symbol of the need to protect the most vulnerable. Their stories, though often forgotten, should serve as a constant reminder that the true measure of a society's progress is not in its wealth or power, but in how it treats those who have nothing. And for the children of the orphan ward, their story, painful as it is, remains a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the strength to survive, to endure, and, in the end, to make sure their voices are finally heard. For the children who had been housed in the orphan ward, the trauma of their early years did not end with the closure of the institution. In fact, for many, the scars of their experiences in the ward continued to shape their lives long after they had left its oppressive walls. The psychological and emotional toll of growing up in such a harsh, neglectful environment manifested in countless ways, often in forms that could not easily be understood or explained by those who had not lived through it. For those who had endured the dehumanizing conditions of the orphanage, the challenges they faced as they transitioned into adulthood were profound, and the impact of their childhood suffering often lasted a lifetime. For many of the survivors, the concept of family, something that so many take for granted, was a foreign and painful notion. They had been torn away from the very people who should have loved and cared for them, and in the ward, they were not given the tools or the support to form healthy attachments. The emotional neglect they suffered during their formative years left deep scars, and as they grew older, many found themselves unable to form the kinds of relationships that others seemed to take for granted. Intimacy, both emotional and physical, became difficult, if not impossible, for many of these survivors. They had never learned how to trust, how to give or receive love. The very act of being cared for, of being shown affection, felt unnatural and foreign to them. As adults, many of the former residents of the orphan ward found themselves haunted by feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness. They struggled with an overwhelming sense of isolation, even when surrounded by people who cared for them. They often felt invisible in the world, disconnected from others, as though they didn't quite belong. These feelings of alienation were a direct result of their early years spent in an institution that had systematically stripped away their individuality, their sense of self-worth. In the orphan ward, they had been treated as mere objects, shuffled from one bed to the next, one set of hands to another, without any real sense of personal value or significance. To grow up in such a place was to feel as though you were nothing more than a statistic, a nameless face in a sea of suffering. For some, the scars of the orphanage took on more overt forms. Survivors often struggled with anxiety, depression, and PTSD, conditions that are often overlooked in discussions about institutional neglect. The constant fear they had lived with in the ward, the fear of illness, punishment, and abandonment, did not simply vanish once they left. It lingered, infecting their relationships, their work, and their everyday lives. Nightmares, flashbacks, and an overwhelming sense of dread could trigger memories of the ward, leaving survivors unable to escape the past. The trauma they had endured as children shaped their adult identities, often leading to a sense of deep emotional numbness or, conversely, intense emotional volatility. Many former residents also struggled with substance abuse, using alcohol or drugs as a means of numbing the pain of their memories. For those who had experienced emotional neglect and physical abuse, the weight of those memories was often too heavy to bear without some form of escape. Substance abuse, while often seen as a form of self-destruction, was, for many survivors, a coping mechanism, an attempt to bury the pain, if only for a short time. Unfortunately, this only added to the cycle of suffering. Addiction, too, became a form of institutionalized abandonment, one that perpetuated the very isolation and neglect that had marked their childhoods. Some survivors managed to build better lives for themselves, but even then, the trauma of their early years often cast a long shadow. They might have succeeded in securing steady jobs or building families of their own, but their emotional struggles were never far behind. Some found solace in raising their own children, determined to give them a better life than the one they had endured. But the damage of their past often haunted their ability to fully connect with their own families. They could give their children material things, but giving them emotional support and care was something they often struggled with. They had never been shown how to do it properly, and so, they found themselves mimicking the very neglect they had received, despite their best efforts to break the cycle. Despite these struggles, many survivors of the orphan ward, those who managed to find a way to rebuild their lives, became some of the most outspoken advocates for reform in the child welfare system. As they reflected on their own childhoods, they realized the profound impact that neglect and institutionalization had on their lives. Many dedicated themselves to speaking out against the mistreatment of children in orphanages and institutions, drawing from their personal experiences to push for changes in how orphan children were cared for. These survivors became the driving force behind a movement for child welfare reform, one that sought to dismantle the harsh, punitive systems that had dominated the treatment of vulnerable children for decades. These voices, once silenced by the institutional systems that had controlled their lives, now became the catalysts for change. They called for more humane treatment of children, better oversight of orphanages, and a focus on individualized care that took into account the emotional and psychological needs of children. The survivors of the orphan ward had lived through a system that had turned them into faceless, nameless children, and now they were using their voices to ensure that no other child would be subjected to the same fate. Their advocacy helped to push forward the eventual closure of many institutions like the orphan ward, and in the decades following, new models of care were developed that focused on providing children with a sense of agency, security, and emotional support. Yet, while these reforms were essential, they came far too late for the survivors of the orphan ward. By the time these changes began to take effect, many of the children who had lived through the institution had already been irreparably damaged by the experience. Their pain, their suffering, and their stories remained a silent testament to the failures of a system that had, for so long, ignored their needs. The orphan ward had closed, but its legacy continued to live on in the broken lives of those who had been its inhabitants. For the survivors, the fight for justice didn't end with their own healing. It extended to the generations of children who had followed in their footsteps. They became staunch advocates for the rights of children in care, and their efforts led to the eventual establishment of more comprehensive child welfare systems. They pushed for greater accountability from the government and called for better training for those who worked with children in institutional settings. They advocated for better mental health services, more robust foster care systems, and a focus on ensuring that children's emotional needs were met alongside their physical needs. It was a movement rooted in the recognition that children were not just bodies to be housed and fed, but souls to be nurtured, minds to be developed, and hearts to be loved. Still, the fight to change the way children were treated in the welfare system was not an easy one. Reformers faced resistance from those who were invested in maintaining the status quo, from those who believed that institutional care was the best solution to the problems of abandonment and poverty. But for the survivors of the orphan ward, this fight was personal. They knew firsthand what it was like to be discarded, to be treated as less than human, to be left to suffer in silence. And so they fought, not just for themselves, but for every child who had ever been caught in the brutal machinery of institutional care. As time went on, the stories of the orphan ward began to surface more frequently. Historians and social scientists began to examine the long-lasting effects of institutionalization on children, particularly those who had been abandoned or orphaned at a young age. They recognized the immense psychological toll that living in such institutions took on children, and they acknowledged the deep emotional wounds left by years of neglect and abuse. These findings validated the experiences of survivors and highlighted the urgent need for reform. In the end, while the orphan ward itself may have been forgotten by many, its legacy was carried forward by the voices of those who had survived it. Their stories, once silenced by a system that had sought to erase them, became a rallying cry for change. The survivors of the orphan ward proved that even in the darkest moments of their lives, they had the strength to rise above the system that had sought to crush them. And through their advocacy, they ensured that the voices of the forgotten children would never be silenced again. As the years passed, the forgotten stories of the orphan ward gradually began to find a place within the broader narrative of New York's growth and transformation. While the ward itself was long closed, the experiences of its former inhabitants continued to haunt the city's collective memory. The survivors, now adults, had carried the weight of their past with them, silently suffering as they navigated the complexities of life. But despite the deep trauma they endured, the legacy of the orphanage was not one of complete despair. There was a quiet, unacknowledged resistance that ran through their stories, a testament to the enduring human spirit, the will to survive, and the longing for justice. For many survivors, the act of simply living through their experiences became a form of defiance. Despite the systemic neglect and abuse, despite being treated as invisible and insignificant by those in power, they had endured. They had survived the trauma of institutional life, and for some, they had even managed to carve out lives for themselves outside of the shadow of the orphanage. But this survival was not a clean or easy process. It was riddled with complexity, pain, and a deep sense of loss. Many of the survivors struggled to reconcile the person they had become with the child they had been, the child who had entered the ward with dreams and hopes, only to have them crushed by the cold, indifferent hands of the institution. The psychological damage inflicted on these children during their time in the orphan ward was profound and long-lasting. In addition to the physical abuse they endured, many also suffered from emotional neglect so deep that it altered their ability to form healthy relationships or trust others. Love, which should have been a constant in their early lives, had been withheld. The absence of love, the absence of nurturing care, left a deep void in their hearts. Some survivors struggled to form meaningful connections with others, trapped in a cycle of emotional isolation. The relationships they attempted to build as adults were often fraught with difficulties, with many unable to provide the kind of emotional support and care that they themselves had never received. For those who tried to build families of their own, the challenges were compounded. Many survivors, despite their best efforts, struggled with parenting. They found it difficult to offer affection or emotional stability to their children, having never learned how to do so themselves. They had been raised in an environment where emotional expression was suppressed, where tenderness was seen as a weakness. To offer that same tenderness to their own children seemed an impossible task. Some survivors turned inward, unable to escape the emotional trauma of their past, while others sought solace in unhealthy coping mechanisms such as alcohol or drugs. These substances, though fleeting in their ability to numb the pain, provided a temporary escape from the gnawing sense of unworthiness that lingered in their hearts. But amidst the darkness, there were small victories, moments when survivors, despite their internal struggles, found a way to break free from the grip of their past.